Chapter 3. The Practice Courts. The next morning Kell heard the chatter of birds. She crept over to her open window and peered outside. It was nearly dawn, with the barest touch of light coloring the sky. Before her was a small courtyard with a single bedraggled tree growing at its center. On it perched house sparrows, drab in their russet brown and tan feathers, the males with stern black collars. Several birds pecked at the circle of earth around the tree. Kell watched them as the pearly air brightened. Poor things, she thought, they're hungry. In her clothes press she had stowed the last of the fruit bread Mindalin's cooks had given her for the journey south. Kell retrieved it and broke it up into crumbs, then dumped it on the courtyard stones. She was watching the sparrows devour it when the first bell rang and someone rapped on her door. She opened it and said a cheerful good morning to the servant who stood there with a pitcher of hot water. "Good is as good does, Page Kelladry," he said, his long face glum. He placed his burden on her desk. "I'm Gower. I'm to look after you." He began to sweep out the hearth as Kell took the water into her dressing room. A new fire was laid when she returned to the main room, her face washed and her teeth clean. "If you've anything special you require, soaps or cloths or such, tell me," Gower said sorrowfully. "Within reason, of course." Kell blinked at him. She'd never met anyone this gloomy. "Thank you, Gower," she replied immediately. "I don't need anything just yet." "Very good, miss," he said, then shook his head. "I mean, Page Kelladry." She sighed with relief when he left and hurried to dress. Undiscouraged by Gower, she wished Neil a good morning when she found him in the mess hall. He looked at her through bleary eyes and mumbled, "There's nothing good about it." Kell shook her head and ate breakfast in silence. The day flew by. It began underground where the palace stores were kept. A tailor took Kell's measurements, then his assistant dumped a load of garments into her arms. She got 3 sets of practice clothes, sturdy tan, cotton, and wool garments to be worn during the morning. She also received 3 changes of the page's formal uniform, red shirt and hose, gold tunic, to be worn in the afternoon and at royal gatherings. Shoes to match her formal gear were added. Her family had supplied boots for riding and combat practice. Neil took the cloaks and coats she was given for cold weather. Once she had stowed her things, Neil took her for another tour. They spent the morning inside, visiting the classrooms, libraries, indoor practice courts, and supply rooms like the Page's Armory on the first level underground. After lunch, Neil took her to the outdoor practice courts and stables, the gardens where she might wait on guests, and last of all the royal menagerie. That night she dreamed the hooting calls of the howler monkeys from the Copper Isles and the chittering of brightly colored finches. The next day she woke not to gaudy finches or to the songs of Yamani birds, but to the friendly gossip of the courtyard sparrows. In hopes of seeing them again, she'd swiped a couple of rolls from the mess hall. Now she tore up the rolls and put the scraps outside the window for the birds. As she finished, the bell rang. Gower rapped on her door as he'd done the day before, bringing hot water. Once he had cleaned the hearth and gone, Kell got dressed and ran to the mess hall. Her first day as a page had begun. After breakfast, the pages flocked to one of the practice yards. Kell would take her first steps on the path to knighthood in these wood-fenced, bare earth rectangles and their adjoining equipment sheds. "I'll work hard," she promised herself. "I'll show everyone what girls can do." 2 Shang warriors, masters of unarmed combat, awaited the pages in the first yard. One of them sat on the fence, looking them over with pale, intelligent eyes. Her short-cropped, tight gray curls framed a face that was dainty but weathered. She was clothed in undyed breeches and a draped, baggy jacket. The other Shang warrior stood at the center of the yard, his big hands braced on his hips. He was tall for a Yamani, golden-skinned, with plump lips and a small nose. His black eyes were lively, particularly for a Yamani. His black hair was cropped short on the sides and longer on top. His shoulders were heavy under his undyed jacket. Both he and the woman wore soft, flexible cloth shoes. "For those of you who are new," he said, no trace of accent in his clear, mellow voice, "I am Hakuin Seastone, the Shang horse. My colleague, who joined me this summer, is Ida Bell, the Shang wildcat." "Don't go thinking you can bounce me all over the ground just because I look like somebody's grandmother," the woman said dryly. "Some grandchildren need more raising than others, and I supply it." She grinned, showing very white teeth. Kel saw the red-headed Merrick swallow. She agreed. The wildcat looked tough. "You older lads pair up and go through the first drills," ordered Hakuin. "Grandmother here will keep an eye on you. As for you new ones," he beckoned them over to a corner of the yard. Once they stood before him, the man continued, "Your first and most important lesson is, learn how to fall. Slap the ground as you hit and roll, like this." He fell forward, using his arms to break his fall. The boys jumped. The sound and the puff of dust he raised made the fall appear more serious than it was. The horse got to his feet and held a hand out to Blonde Quindon. When the boy took it, he found himself soaring gently over Hakuin's hip. Only after he landed did the boy remember to slap the ground. "You have to do that earlier, as you hit," said Hakuin gently, helping Quindon up. "Now." He beckoned to Kel and offered a hand. She took it, meaning to let him throw her as he had Quindon, but the moment she felt his tug, 6 years of Yamani training took over. She turned, letting her back slide into the curve of his pulling arm as she gripped it with both hands and drew him over her right hip. He faltered, then steadied and swept Kel's feet from under her. She released his arm, then tucked and rolled forward as she hit the ground. She surged back up again and turned to face him, setting herself for the next attack. He stood where she had left him, smiling wryly. Horrified, Kel laid her hands flat on her thighs and bowed. She expected a swat on the head or a bellow in the ear. Nariko, the Emperor's training master, had had no patience for people who didn't complete a throw or counter a sweeping foot. When no one swatted or bellowed, she looked up through her bangs. Everyone was staring at her. Kel looked down again, wishing she could disappear. "See what happens when you get too comfortable, Hakuin?" drawled the wildcat. "Someone hands you a surprise. If you'd been a hair slower, she'd have tossed you." "Isn't it bad enough I am humbled without you adding your copper to the sum, Ida?" the horse inquired. "Look at me, youngster," he ordered. When Kel obeyed, she saw Hakuin's black eyes were dancing. "Someone has studied in the Yamani Islands." "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Your teacher was old Nariko, the Emperor's training master, am I right? She always did like that throw. She drilled me in it so many times I wanted to toss her into a tree and leave her there." Kel nodded, hiding a smile. Hakuin looked at the older pages. "I believe you were practicing the first drill for the wildcat?" he asked mildly. Instantly there was a flurry of activity, patterns of kicks, throws, and punches. Hakuin turned back to Kel. "Come show the new ones how to fall. While they practice, we can see what else you know." "Just what they taught the court ladies," Kel said. "Mostly counters to being grabbed or struck." "You were with the embassy?" he asked. Kel nodded. "That explains everything." To the other new pages, he said, "Watch how Kelladry falls." They all stared at her with a combination of confusion and disdain. It occurred to her that she had done the very thing her brother had warned her against. The other pages thought she was showing off. She couldn't help that now. The damage was done. She would just have to make sure she didn't repeat her mistake. With a sigh, she toppled forward, as she had so often in the islands, and smacked the ground. When the next bell of the morning rang, they moved to another practice court. A short black man in the maroon and beige uniform of the palace guard waited for them beside a barrel filled with long wooden staffs. Each of the pages selected one as he passed by. "I am Sergeant Obafem Iziko," announced the uniformed black man in unaccented common. "Formerly weapons instructor to the Imperial Guard of Carthak, now serving the Crown of Tortal. Lord Wildon and I will instruct you in the use of various weapons. Pair up, you new ones at this end of the line. Cleon of Kennan and Vincent of Genlith, come up here to demonstrate." Cleon was the big red-headed boy who was Esmond of Nicoline's sponsor. He went to stand beside the sergeant, spinning his staff idly in his hands. Vincent faced off with him. He was a bony, tall youth. Kell had seen him eating with the handsome Joran at supper and breakfast. "Show them a high block," instructed the sergeant. Vincent defending, Cleon striking. Cleon pulled his staff back and swung it first up, then down. The blow he'd aimed would have struck Vincent on the head or collarbone if it had landed. Instead, Vincent gripped his staff, his hands spread wide apart, and raised the weapon a few inches over his head. Cleon's staff met his with a loud clack. "Observe the strike," the sergeant told them. "Again, Cleon." The big youth repeated the strike, moving slowly. Kell nodded, watching the way his hands shifted on the smooth wood as he lowered it to tap Vincent's skull. From the way Vincent scowled at the bigger youth, Cleon's tap was a little harder than necessary. "Your turn," barked Iziko. He watched as the assembled pages did the strike. The newest boys were clumsy, although they should have had staff practice from their family men-at-arms. Kell was comfortable with the move. The only difference between this and the strike of a Yamani glaive was the weapon she knew best, was that she had no razor-sharp 18 inches of steel at the end of her staff. "Repeat the high block, Vincent," ordered the sergeant. Everyone watched as Vincent moved his hands apart on the staff and thrust it hard into the air, stopping just 3 inches over his head. He angled the staff down on the right to shield his face as well as his head. The sergeant made everyone do the same movement. Then he had Cleon and Vincent demonstrate the middle strike and block, which centered on the chest and belly, and the low combination to attack and defend the legs. Each time he made the pages try the moves. Once they had practiced each movement, Iziko had them stand in 2 lines. The newest pages were paired together. Nealon, who was still new despite having been there during the summer and early spring and early summer, was partnered with Seaver of Tazride, the dark-haired, dark-eyed boy who looked as if he had a Bazir ancestor. Kell was paired with red-headed Merrick of Hollyrose. He was short, compact, and intent on their exercise. Kell licked her lips and settled the weapon in her hands. "Left line strikes, right line blocks," the sergeant told them. He walked along the double line of pages, checking everyone's holds on their staffs. After he'd changed some of the boys' grips and nodded in approval for others, he stepped back. "To my count," he bellowed. "High, middle, low." Staffs clacked as the exercise began and wood met wood. "High, middle, low." Kell struck carefully. Proving herself tough on a smaller opponent wasn't right, and Merrick looked nervous. The lightness of the staff bothered her. A Yamani glaive was far heavier, and she knew that if she forgot she held a lighter pole, she would hit too hard. "Faster! Swing 'em!" cried the sergeant. "I want to hear the wood clack. You don't master the staff, you'll never master the sword. High, middle, low." Over and over, he chanted, increasing the speed. Kell bit her lip, locking her attention on the weapon. "Ow!" someone cried as wood struck flesh. A few moments later, there was another yelp. "Keep going!" yelled Iziko. "If your fingers hadn't been in the way, they wouldn't have gotten hit. Move 'em apart. The rest of you don't need me to count, do you? High, middle, low. I want to hear those staffs beat as one, understand me?" They had been at it long enough to begin to sweat when Lord Wildon came into the yard. He and Iziko walked up and down the 2 lines of pages. Wilden changed Prince Roald's footing. Izuko corrected Esmond of Nicolane's grip. Wilden thrust Neil's high block higher. They reviewed and changed each boy's work until they got to Kell and Merrick. Rather than speak to them or change the way they exchanged blocks and strikes, both men turned and went back up the line, inspecting and correcting the boys a second time. Kell watched them go. Merrick banged her fingers as a result. When she looked at him, he glared at her. "It wasn't my fault they ignored us," she wanted to protest. She didn't. Warriors didn't make excuses. "Switch places!" cried Izuko when he reached the far line of pages. They stopped and repositioned themselves. Izuko began the chant again. High, middle, low. Merrick seemed glad to be the one to hit. His blows fell harder and faster than the count, forcing Kell to respond in kind. Their rhythm fell out of time with their classmates. Kell knew the men saw it, but they continued to focus their attention on the other pages. She kept up with Merrick, blocking his strikes easily. She'd already attracted enough attention for one morning. "Enough," said Lord Wilden at last. "Next," the sergeant informed them, "you will use strikes and blocks in combination. This time, strike your partner, then block his return strike." "Change partners," added Wilden. "Older pages pair with the new ones, and see if you can't better their speed. Come on, switch pairs." The boys looked around, trying to get partners they wanted before someone else did. Unsure of what to do, Kell remained where she was. When everyone formed into two lines again, she was facing the beautiful Joran. Seeing that Kell stared at him, Joran smiled. Kell hid her confusion. The day before, Neil had told her that Joran thought girls did not belong there. Now, Joran smiled at her as if she were his friend. Does he want to make amends, she wondered? "Get to it," Izuko ordered. "Right line starts with the high strike. Left line does a high block, then a high strike. Right line, high block, then high strike. Older lads, go slow with the new ones. Strike, block, strike, block. Kneel and stop flinching. If you get hit, you get hit. Strike, block, strike, block." He kept them at that for a few moments. Joran politely tapped his staff on Kell's as she blocked him. Kell then returned the hit and was blocked by Joran. They continued the rhythm easily. "Switch to the middle strike, middle block, on my mark, ready. Middle strike, middle block, strike, King's Reach, stand still, you won't get dancing lessons till later." Izuko picked up the count. After a while, they switched to putting low strikes against low blocks. Kell felt relaxed. Joran was a good partner, meeting her with just the right amount of force. They traded blows and blocks easily, which gave Kell time to study him. Joran had to be the prettiest boy she had ever seen. For all that he was older, a third-year page, he was only an inch taller, his gorgeous blue eyes nearly level with hers. He'd combed back his long, white blonde hair and secured it in a horsetail for the morning's work. If he were a player, Kell thought, they'd have him doing the young god Balkis Starsworn all the time. Suddenly, Joran's staff shifted under hers, sliding out of position for a block. He drove the lower end of his weapon under her guard, aiming for her ribs. Kell foiled him by stepping out of line. "Back in place, probationer," barked Wilden. The exercise changed again, this time to a high strike against a high block, then a middle strike against a middle block, followed by a low strike and a low block. The speed picked up as well. More and more pages, not all first years, began to make mistakes. Izuko stood by her and Joran, yelling out the count. Kell took up the rhythm of the exercise, but now all her senses were alert. When the pair next to them lost track of which block followed which strike, the sergeant moved to them. In the next moment, Kell struck low and felt Joran's staff glide out from under hers. He swung his staff around and up, jamming it down on her collarbone. She whipped the foot of her staff up and around her arm to deflect him. "This isn't a game, probationer," snapped Wilden. "Stick to the drill." Kell saw a mocking gleam in Joran's eyes. So Neil was right, she thought. He isn't nice at all. Joran held to the drill, but now each block had more force behind it, making it a block and a blow. Each time he struck, he was a little closer to her. Will they yell at him if he drives me back? Kel wondered, or will they only yell if I move out of line? Come on, Queen's Cove, cried Zahir, the tall, young Bashir page. Stop flinching. Kel glanced over. Zahir was driving Neil out of the line of boys, his staff a blur in the air. Neil was blocking Zahir's strikes, but just barely. Wilden and Easygo went to Neil and Zahir just as the tip of Joran's staff banged into Kel's cheekbone. He forced her backward, striking hard. She kept her fingers away from his weapon, thinking fast. If Wilden or the sergeant wasn't going to put a stop to this, she had to. She turned to the side, forcing Joran to move out of line to keep up. In turning, she discovered that the other boys had gathered around Zahir and Neil. They formed a kind of wall in front of Joran and Kel. Neither of the teachers would be able to see what Joran was doing until they forced the pages to form lines again. Joran hit Kel hard and fast, raining blows on her. Do you like this? He demanded, breathlessly, as he pressed her. Do you think you can keep up? Why don't you go home? I belong here, said Kel grimly. She gave way before him, pushing his strikes to either side, thrusting their power away from her. Just like the lioness. Your precious lioness is a mage and a cheat, sneered Joran, hate making him ugly. He tried thrusting his staff past her blocks. When she intercepted him, he'd swing to the side, hoping to smash her ribs. Kel saw they had almost reached the barn that served as one wall of the yard. She would have to do something when they got there. The butt of Joran's staff caught the big muscle in her left thigh. Kel winced, thinking that she'd had just about enough. Joran was all right with a staff, but he wasn't one of the Emperor's ladies. Her brother had warned her against showing off her Yamani skills, but surely he hadn't meant for her to lie down for a bully. Why don't you just get out while you can still walk, Joran whispered as Kel ran into the barn. He faked a strike at her knee. When she blocked it, he turned his staff over, driving it at her ribs. This time, Kel swung her weapon across her chest, pushing Joran's staff into the clear air at her side. Joran recovered, slightly off balance, and swung the butt of his weapon towards her ribs again. Kel pivoted to the side, letting Joran's momentum carry him toward the barn. Holding her staff near the top, she thrust its low end between Joran's calves. He crashed face first into the building. He spun, he was quick, she admitted, and struck at her wildly. I'm done being polite, she thought grimly. This time she thrust her staff under Joran's and up, between his hands. A quick twisting jerk yanked the wood from his grip and sent it flying. Kel then drove her staff towards the flesh at the base of his neck. There she let it rest. As Joran slid away from her along the barn, she followed, keeping the light pressure on his windpipe. If she'd had a glaive rather than a staff, she might have given him a scratch to make sure that he remembered the lesson. What on earth are you doing? She heard Wilden snap. That was not staff work as it is practiced here. Joran looked at him over Kel's shoulder. Kel kept her eyes on Joran, not trusting him. She trained in the palace of the Yamani Emperor. The dry voice belonged to Ida Bell, the Shang wildcat. They're taught the use of a long-bladed pike, a glaive there. How old were you when you started, Keladri? 6, Kel replied. She finally lowered her staff and faced Wilden. The training master was red with anger. This is Tortall, not the Yamani Islands. You are a noble, not a savage with a pig sticker. You will follow the assigned drills. Understand? No Yamani cartwheels, no sleight of hand. It might be wise to teach Yamani methods, said Hakuin, the Shang wild horse. Both he and the wildcat leaned against the fence. Wilden's claim that Yamanis were savages hadn't changed Hakuin's cheery look. He added, You are friends with the islands now, but that hasn't always been so. Even with a royal marriage arranged, there are always misunderstandings. I will take your words under advisement, Wilden said tersely. If we may now resume practice with no more displays. But a polearm makes it possible for a smaller warrior to take a big one, thought Kel, surprised by his attitude. That's why the imperial ladies are taught it, to save their honor and that of their charges. You practice with the probationer, Nealon ordered Iziko. All of you, back in position. After more time spent on staff work, in pairs and alone, Wilden and the pages ran down the long slope behind the palace to the archery range. Kel stayed away from him. After her bout with Joran, it had seemed every time she turned around, Wilden was ordering her to adjust her grip on her staff, change her stance, get her blocks higher, strike lower. It wasn't right. He wasn't correcting the boys nearly as much as he had her, but she vowed she wouldn't let him know she thought so. She would prove that she could take whatever he threw at her. At the archery range, she promised herself that she would not let any of the things she had learned in the islands affect her work here. She might have carried it off if she had been able to go at her own pace. She knew she was in trouble when the archery master told them that since they were expected to know how to use a longbow, he wanted them to pick up their speed. He was everywhere, urging the pages to be quick, quick. Soon, everyone knew that when Kel got flustered, she gripped her bow in the wrong spot 2/3 of the way down. Rushed, she drew the string with her thumb, not her index and middle fingers. She forgot she used a short bow and pulled the string back so far that the arrow dropped away. She bit her tongue and said nothing of the differences between Yamani archery and Tortallon. It's not like I was any good with a Yamani bow, she told herself. After Wilden's comments about foreigners, Kel let him think she made silly errors as she concentrated on correcting her draw and her handling of the arrow. Stone, she told herself, as she picked up a dropped arrow, hearing giggles. For a moment, she was 5 again, listening to the Yamani children laugh and tease the clumsy foreign barbarian. They accepted me in the end, she told herself. These boys will too. Riding, called Wilden when the bell sounded at the end of class. New boys, pick a mount from the spares. That horse will be yours to look after and to ride for now. Saddle your mount and ride him out. Don't take forever. The pages set off for the stable at a trot. Halfway there, Kel noticed that the other 4 new pages were running full out to reach the stable first. She picked up her pace, knowing they wanted to beat her to the best choices of the spares. The group of older pages running ahead of her spread out and slowed down, blocking her without appearing to know she wanted to pass. When she got to the pages' stable, the new boys had made their selections. Their sponsors lounged in front of the stalls as if they dared Kel to even look at the others' selections. They had left her 2 options. One was a chestnut mare with dull, uninterested eyes and a slumped stance. You could be after her a whole week before she'd take a step, thought Kel. The other horse was a small destrier, larger than most of the other mounts, but not as big as the war horses ridden by knights. A gelding, he was a strawberry roan, red-brown stockings, face, mane and tail, and a white-flecked reddish coat. His attention was fixed on Kel, and there was a calculating look in his eyes. There were large scars on his legs and sides. White-haired spots on his back showed where he'd been saddled improperly in the past. The other pages were halfway done saddling their mounts. Neal worked on his horse, a neat brown mare, as he kept an eye on Kel. Kel advanced to the dull-eyed mare, hand outstretched. She had to thrust it under the mare's nose before the horse would do so much as sniff. She's the one you want, a man said, coming out of the shadows at the back of the stable. His clothes were spiked with hay and splashed with dried slobber. His blonde hair looked as if a horse grazed on it. Light blue eyes bulged slightly in a reddish face. The dull mare ambled over and nuzzled him. She's a bit slow, but she's steady. Peach Blossom there's ruined for night's work. Maybe ruined for work at all. He shook his head, eyes sad. Dunno what I'll do with him if he won't take to cart or plow. They're after me to free up his box for when the new mounts come next week. Kel could see it in the stableman's face. He did know what he would have to do. Horses cost money to keep. If they didn't pay for their stall and feed by working, unless they were good for a stud, they were put down. She walked over to the gelding. Reaching into her pocket, she brought out the apple she'd put there and offered it to Peach Blossom. The horse spent more time examining her than sniffing the treat, but he took the apple all the same. He won't bite, miss, said the hostler, coming over. Not with me about, but I can't make him stay good, not without neglecting the others. Sooner or later my effect on him will wear off, and he's got plenty of other tricks. I'll take, did you say Peach Blossom? She said. If he doesn't work out, I'll trade him for one of those new horses you're expecting. He's too big, miss, argued the hostler. He's not someone for that's just learning. He's not for someone that's just learning how knights ride. Let me try, please, Kel replied. I won't hurt him. It's not him I'm worried for, insisted the man. Have you made a choice, probationer? Demanded Wilden. We do ride today, remember. The hostler grasped Peach Blossom's head and laid his face fiercely on the horse's muzzle. You'll be good, all right. I want you to, and sitting in here isn't what you're made for. Behave yourself, Peach Blossom. You know how. He released the horse and nodded to Kel. He'll fare all right for a time at least. If he gets shifty, tell him Stefan told him to be good. He ambled into the shadows at the stable's rear. Kel found the gelding's tack and got to work on saddling him. About to pull the girth tight, she found that Peach Blossom was rounder than he'd first appeared. It was an old trick. The horse swallowed a bellyful of air, making the saddle too loose, ensuring that the rider would slide off. He's testing me, Kel thought. She kneed him in the belly. He turned and looked at her. I'll tell Stefan on you, she whispered. The horse blew out the air he'd sucked in. Kel cinched the girth tight. By the time Wilden reached their end of the building, she and Peach Blossom stood ready. Wilden gazed at Kel and at the horse. If he thought the mount was too big and too hostile for Kel, he kept it to himself. Instead, he ordered her to clean the tack well before she used it again. That done, he told the pages to lead their mounts outside and down the hill. The practice yard was far enough from the stable that the horses would not be forever trying to run for home. Kel was grateful for that. She was big for her age, but Peach Blossom was big too. If he raced for his stall, she would flutter along behind him like a kite at the end of the rein. Wilden and the riding master stood beside the open gate to the yard and observed as each page walked his mount through. Once everyone was inside, the riding master ordered them to form a line, with the horses' heads facing inward. After inspecting the horses, the riding master said quietly, "Mount up." Has anyone ever mounted down? Kel wondered as she swung into the saddle. The moment she settled, she thought that perhaps she'd run rash. Peach Blossom's back was much wider than her pony's. Time was, Neil had explained the day before, pages rode ponies till they were 12 or so. Our stump, though, says that knights ride true horses, and so will pages. My father told me the number of broken bones from horse accidents has quadrupled since Wilden became training master. I should have taken the stupid one, thought Kel. This fellow is too much for me. Peach Blossom sighed as if he'd heard. Kel gritted her teeth. No, I'll keep him. He won't be pulling carts or killed for dog meat, not while I have breath in my body. Knights rode horses, so pages ride horses, she told herself, and sat tall. Peach Blossom looked back at her as if to say, Don't get cocky. Walk 'em Sunrise, ordered the riding master. A foot between you and the next rider. Kel tugged the reins. Peach Blossom didn't move. She tugged harder. Gods, his mouth must be hard as stone, she thought, and yanked. At last the gelding understood, just as Wilden ordered, "Move along, probationer." Peach Blossom turned and walked forward as soon as Kel nudged his sides with her feet. He paced along so amiably that Kel risked a look around. Most of the other mounts were restless, fighting rein and bit. Feeling better as she watched their riders struggle, she turned her eyes ahead. Peach Blossom was stretching out his neck and trying to bite Neil's brown mare. Kel shortened her reins, pulling his head up. "You won't fool me," she whispered. The horse flicked an ear back toward her, listening. "I have nieces and nephews." Peach Blossom blew out as if to say, "Nieces and nephews are all very well, but they aren't me." "Trot 'em," ordered the riding master. Kel kept a watch on her mount. Peach Blossom obviously could not be left to his own devices for so much as a breath. The remainder of the lesson was a series of contests between her and the tricky gelding. When Kel waddled out of the stable, her legs feeling as if she still had a mountain between them, Wilden stopped her. "The boys use the men's baths," he said, without meeting her eyes. "We made arrangements for your bathing, for all that I feel it is a mistake to make even one single exception for you." "So this is fair?" Kel wondered. "He's treating me differently from them, but I feel better about washing up by myself." It was too much to think about. She rubbed her head wearily. He seemed to want an answer of some kind. "I understand, my lord," she told him. He lifted his eyebrows as if he doubted she understood. "You will find a bath ready in your chambers," he said. "I expect you to be on time for lunch." Kel bowed. "If I may go then, my lord." He nodded. She looked at the long, sloping rise to the palace. "You would do better to run that," remarked Wilden. "You need the exercise, but I do not require it of the lads, and I will not ask it of you." "You won't ask it, but I'll do it anyway," she thought stubbornly. "You'll see. I'm as good as any boy. I'm better." Slowly, her legs protesting every step of the way, she began to trot up the hill.